The first time I met Karen Whitmore, she didn't even look at me. Not really. She glanced past me, through me, like I was an inconvenience standing between her and something more important, like the golf course view behind my house. I had just finished planting hydrangeas along my fence line when she strutted over, blonde bob swaying like a metronome of entitlement. She clutched a clipboard, HOA weapon of choice, and let out a dramatic sigh. "Excuse me," she called, voice laced with the patience of someone who thought they were about to do a good deed. "Are you the landscaper? I need to file a complaint." I straightened, wiping sweat from my brow. "I own this house." Karen's face twitched, just for a second, before she plastered on a tight smile. "Oh." A pause. "Then, you must be new." "5 years," I said evenly. Her eyes flicked over my skin, my hands, my clothes, searching for something, some reason I shouldn't be standing on my own land. I already knew the game. Ever since I moved into Oakridge Estates, a gated community filled with manicured lawns, golf carts, and a homeowners association drunk on power, I had felt it. The double takes. The polite but pointed questions. The assumption that I was just visiting. At first, it was microaggressions. The realtor who kept steering me towards smaller homes more in my price range. The security guard who took an extra beat before waving me through. The elderly neighbor who clutched her purse whenever I walked by. But this was new. "I'm Karen Whitmore," she continued, as if her name alone should explain her presence. "Vice president of the HOA." Of course, she was. "Nice to meet you," I said, though it wasn't. She squinted at my yard. "This fence is unusual." It was standard 6-foot cedar, within regulation. She knew that. Before I could respond, she flipped a page on her clipboard. "And this land, you own the parcel behind your house too?" I tensed. "Yes." Karen hummed like that was a problem. "That's quite a lot of land for one homeowner." I frowned. "I bought it legally." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Of course." A pause stretched between us, thick with unspoken meaning. Then, she turned sharply on her heels. "Have a great day," she chirped, already walking away. I watched her go, a chill settling over me despite the afternoon heat. I knew that look. That wasn't the last time I'd be seeing Karen Whitmore. Not by a long shot. The first letter arrived a week later. A crisp white envelope, HOA seal stamped on the front like an official government order. I opened it at my kitchen counter, coffee still steaming beside me. Violation notice. Unauthorized land use. I read it twice. Then a third time. My land, my legally purchased land, was now a concern for the HOA. The letter was vague, full of legalese meant to confuse, but the message was clear. I was being targeted. I stepped outside, scanning my property. The fence stood exactly as it had last week. My hydrangeas hadn't grown into some invasive jungle. Nothing had changed, except Karen knew I owned this land. I folded the letter, exhaling slowly. No sudden reactions. That's how people like her won. By Friday, there were 2 more letters. Violation. Non-compliant landscaping. Violation. Improper use of private property. Every reason was nonsense. My lawn was cut, my fence was within guidelines, and I had permits for every square foot I owned. Karen wasn't just enforcing HOA rules, she was manufacturing problems. I walked to my backyard, heart drumming against my ribs. That's when I saw it. Karen, standing on the other side of my fence, whispering to another neighbor. A man in a polo shirt and boat shoes. Mark, I think. They weren't looking at my garden. They were looking at me. Karen's lips curled into a smirk before she said something under her breath. Mark laughed. Then, as if sensing my eyes, she turned. The smile stayed, but her eyes were sharp, calculating. She lifted a hand in a slow, condescending wave. My fingers tightened around the letter. Something was coming. I just didn't know what yet. By Sunday, I had my answer. A certified letter, hand-delivered by an HOA volunteer, who looked anywhere but at me. Notice of legal action, unauthorized expansion, and HOA bylaws violation. I gritted my teeth. Expansion? Violation? I owned this land outright. It wasn't part of the HOA's jurisdiction. But the wording in the letter suggested they were challenging my ownership, trying to absorb my property into the HOA. I skimmed to the bottom. Filed by Karen Whitmore, Vice President, Oakridge Estates HOA. I slammed the letter onto my counter. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't a simple HOA dispute. This was Karen trying to take my land. And she was about to find out she picked the wrong homeowner to mess with.
I didn't waste time. The next morning, I walked straight into the HOA office, letter in hand. The receptionist, an older woman with tight lips and stiff posture, barely looked up. "I need to speak to Karen Whitmore," I said, keeping my voice calm. She pursed her lips. "Do you have an appointment?" "No, but She's busy." I exhaled sharply. "Then I'll wait." The receptionist hesitated but eventually nodded toward the chairs. I sat, gripping the letter so tightly my knuckles ached. 15 minutes passed, then 20. I watched Karen's office door, waiting. At exactly 30 minutes, it swung open. She stepped out, eyes flicking to me with a flash of surprise before morphing into her signature. Tight-lipped smirk. "Oh," she said, like she'd just noticed me. "Did you need something?" I stood, holding up the letter. "You want to explain this?" Karen's expression didn't change. "I believe the letter explains itself." I scoffed. "You're trying to claim my land belongs to the HOA. That's fraud, Karen." Her eyes twinkled with amusement. "That's a strong word." "It's the right word." Karen sighed, folding her arms. "This community has guidelines. Your property, our property lines should be uniform. The additional parcel you claim to own is in direct conflict with the aesthetics of Oakridge Estates." I stared at her. "Aesthetics?" She nodded, completely unbothered. "We can't have people just expanding." "People?" I repeated, voice dangerously low. Karen blinked, feigning innocence. "Homeowners." I took a slow step forward. "This land wasn't part of the HOA when I bought it. It's separate. You don't have the authority to claim it." She gave me a pitying look. "That's where you're mistaken." She turned, grabbed a folder off the desk, and handed it to me. I flipped it open, and my stomach twisted. A vote had been held. The HOA had proposed annexing unregulated parcels into its jurisdiction. The motion had passed, thanks to a 95% approval rate from the HOA board, which meant Karen and her little inner circle had railroaded it through. I clenched my jaw. "This isn't legal." Karen's lips curled. "You're welcome to contest it. But I should warn you, our legal team is quite experienced." I met her gaze, my pulse hammering. She expected me to fold, to accept this quietly. She had no idea who she was dealing with. I forced a smile. "Great. Then you won't mind if I get my own legal team involved." Karen's smile flickered, just for a second. "Of course not. But I'd hurry. Filing deadlines can be tricky." I walked out, my mind racing. She thought she had me trapped. She was wrong. Gathering evidence. That night I got to work. First, I pulled my property records. My deed was crystal clear. My land was separate from the HOA's jurisdiction. Then I started making calls. The first was to my real estate lawyer. She confirmed what I suspected. The HOA couldn't retroactively claim my land unless I agreed to it, which I hadn't. Next, I contacted my neighbors, particularly the few I knew weren't fans of Karen's power plays. "Did you know about this vote?" I asked. They didn't. Turns out, the community approval Karen bragged about? A sham. The only people who voted were HOA board members, all handpicked by Karen. That was fraud. And I had the proof. Racial bias exposed. I decided to dig deeper. I requested records of past HOA violations. I wanted to see who Karen targeted. The pattern was undeniable. Out of all the homeowners fined, threatened, or sued over violations, 90% were people of color. Meanwhile, white residents got away with the same or worse. A black couple had been fined for an unapproved fence, but a white family 2 streets over had the exact same one with no issue. A Latino homeowner was threatened with a lawsuit for excessive lawn ornaments. His white neighbor had a literal garden gnome army. Karen wasn't just power-hungry. She was racist. And now I had receipts. The stakes rise. I emailed my findings to my lawyer. Her response? This is bigger than just your land. Karen's been abusing her power for years. We had a case. Not just against the annexation, but against Karen herself. But before I could make my next move, something happened. The next morning, I stepped outside, and my fence was gone. Not vandalized. Not damaged. Removed. Karen had escalated. She thought she was untouchable. She was about to learn just how wrong she was. The sight of my missing fence sent a cold, controlled fury through me. I stood at the edge of my property, fists clenched, staring at the empty space where my 6-foot cedar barrier had been. Not broken, not vandalized, removed by someone who thought they had the authority to take what wasn't theirs. I already knew who, Karen. She had been desperate to prove my land wasn't separate from the HOA, and now, with my fence gone, she could claim it was part of the community's shared space. Classic HOA power move: destroy first, justify later. But she wasn't ready for what I had planned. I took a deep breath, steadied my pulse, and made my way to the HOA office. It was time for a reckoning. Karen's power play. The HOA board was already in session when I arrived. The meeting room was packed. Mostly older white homeowners, chatting like they were at a country club brunch. Karen sat at the head of the table, the queen of her little fiefdom, basking in attention. She saw me the moment I walked in, and she smirked. "Ah," she said sweetly, loud enough for the room to hear. "If it isn't our most passionate homeowner." I didn't take the bait. I walked straight to the table and dropped a stack of documents in front of her. "You tore down my fence," I said, voice calm but sharp. Karen feigned innocence. "Your fence was in violation." "Violation of what?" I shot back. "You didn't even notify me." She gave a condescending chuckle. "The HOA has the right to remove unapproved structures." I leaned in. "You mean private property?" Her expression didn't waver, but I saw it. The flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. "I don't know what you mean," she said smoothly. "The board voted to annex unregulated parcels. Your land is now part of Oakridge Estates." She sat back, crossing her arms, her voice dripping with condescension. "I understand this is confusing for you, but the law is the law." A few people chuckled. I caught Mark, the neighbor she'd whispered to, grinning smugly. They thought they had won. I smiled. "You're right, Karen. The law is the law." Then I pulled out my trump card. The turn of the tide. I placed my property deed on the table, turning it toward the board members. "This document," I said, tapping it, "proves my land is separate from the HOA's jurisdiction." Karen barely blinked. "That doesn't matter. The board." I held up another document. "And this? This is the HOA's own bylaws. You can't retroactively claim land without the owner's signed consent." The smirk faltered. I wasn't done. "Here's the real kicker," I said, sliding another set of papers forward. "These are county zoning laws. You cannot annex private land without a unanimous vote from affected homeowners. Not an HOA vote, a homeowner vote. You didn't even notify me." The room shifted. A few people murmured. Karen's grip on her pen tightened. I leaned forward. "That means every action you've taken? Illegal." Silence. Karen's face paled for a split second before she forced a smile. "Well, I suppose we can revisit the—" I cut her off. "Oh, we're way past that." Then I pulled out my final weapon. A legal injunction. "Filed this morning," I said, sliding it across the table. "You're officially blocked from taking any further action against my property." Karen's mask cracked. "You can't." I held up my phone. "I can." And I did. "My lawyers already notified the county. Any further interference will be considered trespassing." The room went dead silent. Karen's fingers twitched, like she wanted to snatch the papers and tear them apart. But I wasn't finished. I turned toward the other homeowners. And for those of you wondering why I was targeted, I pulled every HOA violation from the past 3 years. I tossed the final document onto the table. Turns out, 90% of the fines, threats, and legal actions were against homeowners of color. Gasps, whispers, eyes darting to Karen, who had gone rigid in her chair. I let the weight of my words sink in. This isn't about regulations. It's about power, and who Karen thinks deserves to live here. A few heads nodded. Others looked uncomfortable. Then, a voice from the back. This is unacceptable. An older white man stood up, one of the founding HOA members. He looked between Karen and me, face grim. This isn't how we do things, he said. Karen's mouth opened, then closed. Her carefully built empire was crumbling. I locked eyes with her. Checkmate. And she knew it. Karen's fingers twitched. She tried to mask her panic, but I saw the way her breath quickened, the way her polished nails drummed anxiously against the table. This wasn't the meeting she'd expected. She had assumed I'd be just another homeowner steamrolled by the HOA's unchecked power. But now, the entire room was watching her, whispering. Her control was slipping. She cleared her throat, forcing a smile. Now hold on, she said, raising her hands like she was soothing an unruly child. There's clearly been a misunderstanding. I raised an eyebrow. Oh? Which part? The illegal land grab or the racial bias? A murmur rippled through the room. Karen let out a tight laugh. That's a serious accusation. She turned toward the board members, trying to rally them. Look, we all know these regulations exist to keep our community beautiful and fair. We simply want to ensure property values remain strong. Oh, you want to talk about fairness? I cut in, pulling my final weapon from my bag. A USB drive. Karen's eyes flicked to it. I inserted it into my laptop and turned the screen toward the room. This, I said, pressing play, is footage from my security cameras. The smoking gun. The video played. The room watched in stunned silence as Karen, flanked by 2 HOA maintenance workers, walked into my backyard in the dead of night, saw in hand. They cut down my fence piece by piece, loading it onto a truck. Karen stood there, supervising, arms crossed, a smug smile on her face. When they were done, she dusted off her hands and muttered, "That should put him in his place." A gasp rippled through the crowd. Someone swore under their breath. Karen's face drained of color. I let the footage loop, playing it again. And again. Karen shot up from her seat. This is manipulated," she stammered. "This isn't real." I folded my arms. "Security cameras don't lie, Karen." She turned to the board members, her voice shrill. "I was ensuring compliance. He put up that fence illegally." A woman in the back scoffed. "You just watched a video of yourself committing trespassing and vandalism." Karen whipped around. "That footage is taken out of context." A man in a business suit stood up, frowning. "What's the context where breaking into someone's property at night is legal?" Karen opened her mouth. No words came out. Her world was crumbling. The final blow. I turned to the HOA board president, an older man named Bill who had been uncomfortably silent until now. "I assume you'll be removing Karen from her position immediately?" I asked. Bill hesitated. Sweat dotted his forehead. "Well, we need to, follow the proper procedures." I smiled. Good thing I brought some help. At that moment, the county commissioner walked in. Karen's face went white. The commissioner adjusted his tie. "I received a complaint about some questionable HOA practices." He glanced at me, and after reviewing the evidence, I'd say that complaint was valid. Karen spun toward him. "This isn't necessary." He held up a hand. "Actually, it is. We're launching a full investigation into HOA misconduct. And based on what I've seen so far, I'd recommend every board member start distancing themselves from certain individuals." Eyes turned toward Karen. She staggered back, breath shaky. "You can't do this," she whispered. I tilted my head. "Can't I?" The commissioner continued. "Effective immediately, Karen Whitmore is suspended from all HOA activities. And pending the investigation, She may be permanently barred from serving on any homeowners association in the county. Someone clapped. Karen's head snapped up. A younger black couple near the door smirked. "Oh, sorry," the husband said, not looking sorry at all. "That just felt deserved." A few other homeowners nodded. The tide had turned. Karen was finished. Public humiliation. She tried one last time. "You can't just strip me of my position," she seethed. "I've dedicated years to this community." I shrugged. "Yeah? And how many people did you screw over in that time?" A woman near the front shook her head. "Honestly, Karen, you've been a nightmare for years. It's about time someone stood up to you." Another person added, "My cousin had to sell his house because of your fines. You pushed him out." More voices joined in. Karen's mouth trembled. She looked around, waiting for someone, anyone, to defend her. No one did. Her power was gone. Her influence shattered. The commissioner sighed. "You'll be notified about upcoming legal proceedings. I'd suggest hiring a lawyer." Karen let out a broken laugh. "You're all turning on me? After everything I've done?" Silence. Then Bill, the HOA president, stood and removed her nameplate from the table. "I think the board will be handling things from here," he said stiffly. Karen stared at the empty space where her name had been. Her legacy erased. Her empire gone. She turned to me, eyes burning with hatred. "You'll regret this." I smiled. "No, Karen. I think you will." And with that, I walked out. Behind me, I heard the whispers. The people she once ruled over, they were celebrating. The next morning, the HOA office was in chaos. Karen's downfall had spread like wildfire. The neighborhood Facebook page was flooded with posts. HOA president caught trespassing. Security footage leaked. Racial bias in our community? Here's what the records show. Karen Whitmore removed from the HOA. Investigation launched. By noon, the local news picked it up. By evening, Karen's entire reputation was in flames. The fall of Karen Whitmore. 2 days later, I stood on my porch, sipping coffee, watching as officials arrived at Karen's house. A black SUV with county government plates, a uniformed officer, and a man in a sharp suit, likely from the Attorney General's office. Karen stepped outside, looking wrecked. No power suit, no condescending smirk, just a woman who had lost everything. I could almost hear the conversation from my porch. "Mrs. Whitmore, you're being investigated for fraud, illegal property annexation, and harassment." Her hands trembled. "This is ridiculous. I was trying to uphold the community standards." The agent didn't budge. "You used HOA funds illegally. You targeted homeowners of color disproportionately. And you engaged in criminal trespassing." Karen's jaw tightened. The officer handed her a court summons. Karen's face went ghost white. For the first time, she wasn't in control. The neighborhood reacts. That night, there was an impromptu gathering outside my house. Neighbors, some I barely knew, came over holding drinks, shaking my hand. A Latina woman named Maria sighed. "I got fined $500 for having a flower pot on my porch. I knew something was wrong, but I was afraid to speak up." A black man named Darren shook his head. "Karen harassed my wife over the way we landscaped our yard. But she never said a word to the white families with overgrown bushes." More stories poured out. One by one, people admitted what they had ignored. The fines, the intimidation, the coded language Karen used when she spoke about certain homeowners. They had let it happen. But not anymore. Taking back our community. 2 weeks later, the HOA held an emergency election. For the first time, the entire community showed up. Karen's supporters, what little remained, were drowned out by real voices. Maria was voted onto the board. Darren became the new HOA treasurer. And as for Karen's old allies, they resigned before they could be investigated further. When the votes were counted, I was officially offered a seat on the board. I declined. "I didn't fight for power," I told them. "I fought for fairness." They understood. Final justice. A month later, a foreclosure notice appeared on Karen's front door. Turns out, when you illegally funnel HOA funds for personal projects, you get hit with massive lawsuits. The county fined her into oblivion, and with her name blacklisted from every HOA in the state, she had no way to climb back. She was forced to sell her house. The same house she once used as her personal kingdom. The same house where she lorded over everyone else. And just like that, she was gone. Peace at last. Months passed. The neighborhood changed. With new leadership, the HOA actually worked for the homeowners instead of controlling them. The ridiculous fines disappeared. The hostility evaporated. And as for me, I rebuilt my fence. This time it was taller, stronger, not just a fence, a statement that I wasn't going anywhere, that no one would push me out of what was rightfully mine. And as I stood in my yard, watching the sun set over my land I fought for, I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding. Karen was gone. Justice had been served. And finally, I was home.